All right, welcome to everyone. My name is Christina Hartlieb. I'm the Executive Director here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online. And we appreciate you joining us today for our Curator Talk with Ann Buening for the exhibit, The Cause Dearer to Me Than Any Other in the World, Isabella Beecher Hooker and Suffrage. And she's going to be talking about all the Beecher sisters and how they all kind of work their way into or out of the suffrage question. So because we have this set up as a meeting, what I would like everyone to do is to leave their cameras off for now and make sure that you're on mute. You can even, up in the top right corner, if you click on speaker view, then you will be able to see just Ann as she's speaking and her slideshow that has a lot of visuals about the things that she's going to be talking about. And then if you think of questions as she's going, feel free to write those in the chat and we will be able to get to those at the end. And we will also at the end encourage people to turn their speakers and turn their cameras and speakers on so that we can have a discussion as well. So without a lot of additional information, I would like to say again, thank you for joining us. The exhibit that we are highlighting today is The Cause Dearer to Me Than Any Other in the World, Isabella Beecher Hooker and Suffrage. The exhibit was funded by the Ohio Humanities Council and the W.E. Smith Family Foundation. So we do definitely want to thank our sponsors for this exhibit. Ann Buening is a longtime volunteer and a member of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House Board, and her day job is at the Art Museum, the Cincinnati Art Museum, I should say. So I will let Ann take it away and share with us her information about the exhibit.
Okay. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you guys for joining me today. I am so excited to be talking about Isabella, and I'm trying really hard not to look at the boxes on the side of my screen and not my camera. This exhibition really kind of came about because of the 100-year anniversary for women's suffrage in the United States. We wanted to have an exhibition that really kind of focused on the Beecher family and their part in women's suffrage in the United States. And that was really pretty much personified by Isabella, who was the youngest daughter. And this is a great photograph of her right here. Real quick, I'll give a very brief overview because it's a very complicated history about women's right to vote in the United States. It essentially starts, generally speaking, in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention. And so this is the list here of every single woman and all of the men who signed. They put up 11 sentiments, and they called their Declaration of Sentiments for Women's Rights. And this is all the people who signed that. Basically, what we have happening in the United States, it's really not until the 19th century that you have a lot of women who all of a sudden feel like they can break out of their home sphere. Now remember, this is the 1800s, so it's the separate spheres. Women are in the home, men are out in the business world and running everything. Excuse me, I'm also getting over a cold. So what's happening at this point is with the Industrial Revolution, you see greater and greater wealth gaps are happening within the United States. And a lot of these women start looking around and going, well, we can help this because, you know, we're supposed to be the arbiters of morality in the United States. And so they're using that as their excuse to get involved in more things outside of the home, one of which was the Abolitionist Movement. And so Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I believe, were at a abolitionist meeting in 1840, and they were not allowed to speak, and that really upset them because the reason that was given to them was because they were women, and that really started off the whole entire women's rights movement within the United States that really picked up momentum and ended up with this at Seneca Falls. So this is what's going on in the background of Isabella's life. This slide here, so this is our Cincinnati connection with Isabella. She moved here to Cincinnati in 1831 when she was, excuse me again, when she was 11 years old. And the photo on the right side of the screen, that is what the Harriet Beecher Stowe House looked like when the family lived there. Obviously very different from how it looks like today. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with it, on the corner there of Martin Luther King and Gilbert. On the left you see is a, and I do have a, yes I do. So this is where the house stands. This is an old map from the 19th century. And here is Lane Seminary, which is how the Beechers ended up, the reason why the Beechers ended up in Cincinnati was because Isabella's father, Lyman Beecher, was recruited to be the first president of Lane Theological Seminary. And I guess I want to start off with this really great quote where Dr. Leonard Bacon of Yale University, he once commented that there were 3 types of people in America: saints, sinners, and Beechers. And it's a wonderful quote because it really kind of encapsulates how much this family really influenced America and American history. It all kind of starts with Lyman, Harriet's father, or sorry, Isabella's father as well. And there he is. He's in the center of this photograph right here. That's him surrounded by all his children. So he himself, Lyman, ended up writing over 100 books that commented on and also inspired religion. He was also a big instigator in social change. And he was a very influential evangelical minister whose theology really kind of espoused a social activism that should be used to spread the gospel, which was a really kind of an unusual thing to be doing in the beginning of the 19th century. So when he came here to Cincinnati to lead Lane, it was his intention to train ministers who would have a sound morality and an unwavering confidence in the truth of their gospel. And what he really kind of emphasized was that these people should be working towards voluntary associations of the wise and the good to aid the civil magistrate in the execution of the laws, and yet also have a spirit of missions that would then convert the world. So he had really high expectations of his students, and he had those exact same expectations for all of his children. And so evening meals were often characterized by having these really long debates that trained all of his 11 children who survived into adulthood to be really great debaters, and this is how we're going to argue for what's right and what we need to be doing in this country. And he expected all of his sons to follow him into the ministry. The girls, he kind of was a little less concerned about their educations, as Isabella once bitterly recalled at the end of her life. At 16 and a half, just when my brothers began their mental education, mine was finished, except as life's discipline was added with years and what we shared equally. Till 23, their father, poor minister as he was, could send them to college and seminary, all 6, cost what it might, but never a daughter cost him $100 a year after she was 16. So obviously, this was most likely something that was a feeling that was shared by not just Isabella, but also all 4 of her, or 3 of her sisters. I will mention, you see down here, we have these 2 little insets in the photograph. These are the 2 sons who were not actually physically present for the photograph when it was taken in 1859 at the family. This is George over here. He actually, depends which historian you read, it was either a hunting accident or suicide. He died of a shotgun wound in 1843. And then this is James, who is the youngest son, and he wasn't in this photograph because he was actually in China. But pictured here, so there's Lyman in the center. There's Isabella here, she's the youngest daughter. This is Catherine, who's the eldest daughter. And then the next daughter down the line, this is Mary, and then Harriet, whose name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And really, her sisters had a great influence on Isabella's life. And we kind of wonder if that would not have been as true of a woman being successful outside of the home in the Beecher family if it hadn't been for Catherine, who was the eldest child of the entire Beecher clan. She was born in 1800, and she was a very strong personality. A lot of historians write about how her siblings were often rather exasperated with her because she had very strong opinions and was always trying to force them on them. And because of this, that she was the first child and that she was very active in being involved in her father's life as a young girl, a lot of historians sort of wonder what would have happened if, whether or not Catherine would have had such a strong personality. One of the things that was really kind of amazing was she chose to really revolutionize women's education in the United States. So beginning in 1823, she opens up her first seminary, as she called them, for girls in Hartford, Connecticut. Then she opened one up here in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1833. And then she did another one in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1850. And what she did with these schools was she really thought that girls had to know things to survive, like not just how to read and write and paint pretty pictures and dance, but also to do math and sciences, which was really unusual at the time. And so she starts writing textbooks, and then from writing textbooks, she moves into religion, health, family life, the Abolitionist Movement, and she also has very strong opinions about women's rights. But for her, it wasn't women's rights to vote, it was women's rights to a professional career in teaching. And she was very specific on that women should just be teachers, because she saw that as a relationship to women's roles as mothers, being instructors for their children. Later on in her career, she added in nursing on it, but for the most part, she was pretty stuck on just teaching. And but at the height of her career, she is considered to be one of the most influential voices in America, shaping the ideals of what middle-class American women should be thinking and doing. In the center here, we have Mary Beecher Perkins. She's the next daughter. She's pretty much the only Beecher in the entire family who avoided being in a public light. She was also kind of conservative in her views. She strove to be the ideal of womanhood that all of her sisters spent a lot of time trying to write about. And there's this quote that gets used over and over again. She once wrote to Isabella because she was trying to caution her youngest sister not to be too forward, too liberal, and too out there. And so she wrote to tell her, "I could not perform any of my duties if I gave way to my feelings and allowed myself to attend meetings and become as much interested as I easily could." So it's really kind of this idea, you know, your whole life is just centered around your husband and everything else and your family. For Mary, she actually ends up marrying a lawyer, Thomas Perkins, and they live in Hartford, Connecticut. And for all that Mary wasn't actively involved publicly, she was behind the scenes very much in support of her family. Catherine stayed with her very often. She also let Harriet stay with her. So her sisters really stayed with her when Catherine was getting some of her schools set up, and her sisters were acting as teachers within the schools. Mostly Harriet did. And also she raises Isabella after Isabella's mom, Harriet Porter Beecher, passes away in 1835. On the far right, we have a picture of Harriet Beecher Stowe with her two twin daughters, Hattie and Eliza. I chose that picture because it's not one that most people get to see very often. So I thought it was a nice change. Harriet, of course, is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin that gets published beginning in 1851. But she was 40 years old when she publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin and really becomes kind of this like powerhouse within the abolitionist movement and also the United States literary world. Excuse me. She came to Cincinnati at the age of 21 to be a teacher in Catherine's school that she opens up here. And then, of course, she marries Calvin Stowe, who was a professor at the Lane Theological Seminary. Because Calvin wasn't getting paid very much as a professor, Harriet starts writing professionally, which, of course, her first novel is Uncle Tom's Cabin. And then she goes on to write 8 other novels, over 100 short stories, and then also countless articles that covered a whole range of subjects and other contemporary issues. What's interesting about the sisters, the public sisters, between Catherine, Harriet, and Isabella is that there's 11 years between each one. So if you think about it, Catherine is almost an entire generation older than Isabella, which really plays a huge, huge part in how each one of them approached women's rights. This slide here is a whole slew of pictures on Isabella. Up in the far left corner, this is a portrait that is thought to be Isabella with her mother, Harriet Porter Beecher, done about 1830. In the center top there, that's a picture of Isabella in the 1840s. In the upper right, that's a photograph of John Hooker, who she marries in 1841. She met him because he was working as a clerk in Thomas Perkins' law office, which is how the two met and eventually became engaged. Isabella is by far the most liberal of Lyman's daughters. It took her a long time to kind of find her calling as a suffragist. In the beginning, she's kind of set off by getting involved in any kind of social justice issues or mostly being public. And a lot of that really stems from her experience here in Cincinnati as a young girl, because when she was 12 in 1834, we have the anti-slavery debates at Lane. And that was a really contentious thing that her father had to go through. And unfortunately, it ended up rather badly for him because all but 8 of the students left Lane in protest that Lane, the board mostly, was unable to support this idea of abolitionism for all those people in slavery. So because this nearly destroys Lyman's career, it really leaves a mark on Isabella where she just thinks, oh gosh, this was just horrible. It was so horrible for my father. So she just really thinks of it in terms of the effect on her father. So she's, because of that, doesn't want to support the abolitionist movement. However, her husband, John Hooker, was an incredibly progressive lawyer. He was an incredibly passionate abolitionist. And so he really kind of inspires her to get involved within the abolitionist movement. But in the 1840s and the 1850s, she really kind of just focuses on her role as a wife and a mother. So along the bottom here, we have pictures, these lovely photos of her with all 3 of her children. So there's Alice, Mary, and their son, Ned. And so it wasn't until after Harriet publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin that Isabel starts thinking, there's more I could be doing with my life. I mean, here's my older sister. She has her life outside the home. Catherine also has one as well. But most people point to Harriet's influence, success as an older woman after her children were older. I mean, Harriet was 40 when she publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so you have Isabella kind of like thinking about, what's my identity? What can I do outside of my home? And so in 1859, what's really important is Isabella reads Thomas Wentworth Higginson's women's right article that he titled "Ought Women to Learn the Alphabet?" And so the whole point of this was really how much education should women have? And he was obviously in support of women having education and also through their education gaining a right to vote for themselves. And this just really floored Isabella, this whole idea. While she was still in the engagement period with John, she did write to him some concerns she had about, what's my life going to be like? Is I'm just going to be your wife and your mother? As like I see unhappiness with my older married sisters with their relationships, and I don't want that to happen to us. But after she's married, she doesn't really mention it again until she reads this article by Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And she actually finds Higginson and she writes to him and she starts this whole entire correspondence. And so he starts kind of influencing her and saying, yes, you should start writing some of these opinions down. So what she does is she starts writing essays, and they don't always get published. She was rather, even from the very beginning, kind of liberal. As she liked to say, I do not find it easy to give up thinking wherever I am and however occupied, and of late this question is taking such practical shape, I can hardly keep out of the frame, and resolutely vowed I would not talk with any man who was not already of my mind in this matter. What she does very early on is she writes this article called Shall Women Vote? A Matrimonial Dialogue. She writes this in 1860. It's her first attempt to write about women's rights. And it was initially kind of a reaction to an editorial that criticized her elder half-brother Henry Ward Beecher. She tried sending it out for publication. It was never actually published during her lifetime, but it has become more well-known now, especially than it was even when it was first published. Basically, her argument in this essay was to declare motherhood to be the foundation of women's political expertise. She claims that a mother's ability to adapt to each child's distinct personality and keep them together and whole in the family and try to keep them pacified was what she called women's training to be involved in politics. And so because of this, she thought the women as natural politicians and therefore obviously should be given the right to vote. And then, excuse me, sorry, it was a really bad cold. And so this kind of idea that women as natural politicians was not something a lot of people were really kind of ready to accept. So she keeps trying. In 1868, she writes another article called A Mother's Letters to a Daughter on Women's Suffrage. And this does get published, but anonymously in Putnam's magazine. She doesn't actually put her name onto it until almost 20 years later when she reprints it as a tract for the Connecticut Woman Suffrage Association. So she repeats her belief that motherhood prepares women for public and political life, but then she also adds on this idea that children need to be educated to change the social norms so that women can be viewed as equal to men. And she really emphasizes that sons really need to be taught this so that when they grow up, they won't have quite as much of this idea that women are secondary citizens. As Isabella writes, I am charged with the crime of desiring to meddle with politics and to educate my daughters as well as my sons to take an intelligent and, if need be, an active part in the government of their country. And I am convinced that these sons will not fail ere long to be the first to recognize the propriety and wisdom of such a course on my part. So 1860 is really, 1868, I'm sorry, is really kind of when she plunges herself into the women's suffrage movement. That is the year she works with Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Paulina Wright Davis, and they established the New England Women's Suffrage Association. In 1869, she meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who you see pictured there on the far right. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were really kind of seen as radicals in the women's rights movement. And most of that's because they support the idea that women should have the right to divorce if their marriage is unhappy. For them, it was a way to protect women who are in abusive relationships that they couldn't get out of them. Unfortunately, because they were supporting divorce, a lot of people kind of labeled them as free love supporters. And that was like one of the worst things you could say about a woman at this time. And so, so a lot of people tried to warn Isabella away from them because of these radical beliefs. But Isabella, being a Beecher, it just kind of, she just loved embracing everything that was she just felt to be true to her heart. And because she was a Beecher, you had to be incredibly passionate about everything you did. And so she just loved these women a whole lot. And in fact, she declares them to be worthy leaders and representatives of the cause dearer to me than any other in the world. And so it's shortly after she meets them that she really kind of just throws herself into the whole thing. She organizes a suffrage convention in Hartford, Connecticut that leads to the creation of the Connecticut Woman Suffrage Association. Anthony and Stanton themselves quickly realize that Isabella has that Beecher knack for organizing large events and really kind of bringing in all the social contacts of the family that they know. And so they quickly come to depend on her as they're organizing the National Women's Suffrage Association. That's their branch of women's rights movement. They would hold a yearly convention in Washington, D.C. every year. And so beginning in for the January 1870 convention, Isabella just really kind of threw herself in and got it organized and was just really helping them. Also happening in 1870, the following month, in February, the 15th Amendment is ratified. And of course, that is the amendment that gives all men, despite their race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the right to vote. And the
And we suddenly can't hear you anymore. Are you? Anne, we're having trouble hearing you right now. Oops. Hang on. Let's see if we can figure this out. Anne, can you hear me? Because we're having trouble hearing your sound right now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, yes.
Wait a minute, I can't hear you. Oh no, what happened? Oh dear. Microphone same, speakers same.
Is it working now? Can other people hear me?
Oh dear.
It says your network bandwidth is low.
Okay, I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. I think you guys can hear me now, but I can't hear anyone.
Okay, keep going then.
Okay, all right. So as long as you can hear me now, I will continue on. I apologize for that.
Do you need me to put the slides up so that you're not using up more of that space?
I'll start sharing again. I'll go back. Okay, all right. I am so sorry. Technical difficulties with Zoom. So she's getting very involved in the NWSA. So with the 15th Amendment, that's the first amendment that really says that women can't vote because of their sex. So the NWSA really kind of takes this idea that it creates this aristocracy of sex. And because up to that, they had been trying to argued that women had a constitutional right already to vote because they were considered citizens of the United States. And so with this, that really kind of made them stop and try to come up with a new argument. This also kind of really sets off Isabella herself, where she starts to really kind of like get support for women's suffrage. She goes on a speaking tour that takes her to Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, so all over the Midwest. And she's also speaking to local suffrage groups. She's helping set up new organizations in all the towns that she visits. She organizes a second large suffrage meeting in Connecticut. And then she also takes over planning the 1871 NWSA convention in Washington entirely for 1871. So she's just raring on all cylinders until 1872. And that's when scandal really hits the Beecher family. We've got, it really starts with this woman here up in the corner. That is Victoria Woodhull, who was a very polarizing figure in the late 19th century in the United States. She set herself up as the first female candidate to run for president, even though she herself did not have the right to vote. In 1871, right when the NWSA convention is happening in Washington, D.C., she just kind of waltzes in and forces her way into a judicial committee meeting where she reads this whole list of her beliefs about women's rights and women's rights to suffrage. And that's what this cartoon down in the center is all about. And this really shocked the NWSA that she was able to do this, because they had been trying, putting all their contacts to work, everyone that the Beechers knew, they were writing to everybody, and they were just getting shut out over and over and over again. But then Victoria Woodhull somehow succeeds where they didn't. And so in this image, you see there's all these women in there, and those are all the NWSA women who just come and join this meeting because they want to see what Victoria has to say, and they're just, like I said, just wondering how she did it. So they end up inviting her to join them for the 1871 convention. And Isabella, being Isabella, just immediately falls in love with Victoria, thinks she's great, she's wonderful, even though everyone is just kind of like, you've got to be kidding me. She's so radical, she is beyond crazy. She's worse than Stanton and Anthony. And in fact, the cartoon that you see on the right side there, that's by Thomas Nast. And you see Victoria Woodhull is depicted as Satan. And she's holding up this testimony where she's like, these are what rights I want women to have. And then you have this woman going, no, I'm good on my hard, rocky road supporting my drunkard husband and my 4 children who I can't support because my husband's always drinking. This, as a cartoon, doesn't really work as a political cartoon. It really kind of makes it look like, gosh, women should be really following Victoria Woodhull. But this is the image that you will see reproduced in book after book after book where Victoria Woodhull is mentioned. They always produce this cartoon by Thomas Nast. So what's happening in 1872 is Victoria Woodhull has become a really close friend with Theodore Tilton, and this is Theodore Tilton down there in the lower left corner. And Theodore Tilton is kind of a protege of Henry Ward Beecher, who you see in the lower center. And through Tilton, she really gets to know Henry Ward Beecher, and she tries to get him to support with the women's rights movement as she saw it, with all the radical ideas, because she was very much openly a free love supporter. She herself had her first marriage was a very bad, abusive one, and they ended up getting divorced, and then she married this other man, but then she keeps her first husband's name. She never takes her second husband's name, and then her second husband ends up living with her again because he's so ill he can't take care of himself. So she's got this really interesting life, and everyone's just writing about her. She was incredibly sensationalized in newspapers. And so she was trying to get a legitimate support by getting Henry Ward Beecher to come and introduce her in one of her speeches on women's rights. and he kept kind of like waffling on whether or not he was going to do it. And so she kind of threatens him, like, either you'll help me or I will tell everyone about this affair that you were having with Theodore Tilton's wife, Libby. And I guess Henry Ward Beecher just thought it would blow over. She wouldn't do it. And except true to her word, she announces it to the world. She ran her own newspaper and she published the entire affair in her newspaper. And that really started off this huge, huge scandal for the Beecher family. So at the top here, these are just two of the political cartoons I was able to find surrounding the scandal. And then you see in the lower right-hand corner there was actually a book that was put out describing everything that happened within this. So this was literally the thing that the United States was talking about in 1872 all the way through 1875, just because of various trials and other things that were happening all around this. And so the Beecher family really kind of like closes ranks around Henry Ward because they're just like, there's no way he was having an affair, even though everyone knew he was doing it. And so they were quick to publicly declare his innocence, except for Isabella. She was the one Beecher who was just going like, no, he needs to fess up to the public and realize what he was talking about. And for her, this comes down to an issue of morality, because here you have Henry Ward Beecher, who as a preacher was speaking specifically about respecting your wife and the sanctity of marriage. And here he is having an affair with Libby. And so for Isabella, she really, really thought that he needed to come out publicly and just like own up to what he did. Obviously, he wasn't going to do that though, because, you know, this was the 1870s. But she and her husband, John, had known about it. John himself has gone off and did his own research into it to figure out how much of this was true, what was hearsay. And so they knew exactly what was going on. But as kind of a response to Isabella not supporting Henry, her family just really shuts her out. And then what's really kind of crazy is that her brothers start communicating with her through the New York newspapers in this very public manner, where they start questioning their sister's sanity. And in fact, they actually contact a psychologist to write in his opinion about Isabella, and he just basically wrote, oh, she's temporarily driven insane by Victoria Woodhull's satanic influence, and that she should be committed to an insane asylum. And this is all happening publicly in the newspapers. And so you can see how this would really damage Isabella's credibility within the public. It really affects her passion and everything else to be out there working for the women's rights movement. And so it was just this horrible, horrible thing for her. And so what she does is she and John, just trying to flee from the whole scandal and everything, they go on an extended trip of Europe. However, right before she leaves, Isabella publishes her only book, which is called Womanhood, Its Sanctities and Fidelities. And this is a crazy book too, that you would think that you would write and then publish, especially considering what's going on with your family within the same time. And so within this book, she is frankly discussing sex, prostitution, birth control, abortion, the advocacy for a single sexual standard for women, so no longer that double-edged sword that women have to like deal with, which obviously we're still dealing with today. And so she includes in it an article she wrote in 1867 on sex education for boys, her correspondence with John Stuart Mill, who was an English philosopher, who also greatly influenced British thought and political discourse, in particular with women's rights. And then she also includes extracts from the work of Josephine Butler, who's another English woman who opposed the Contagious Diseases Act in England, which regulated prostitutes but not their clientele to prevent the transmission of sexual disease. And pretty much everyone who read this book and then were reading between the lines, they really kind of saw it as her justification for her refusal to stand by Henry Ward's side. So it's really kind of an amazing thing to put out completely against what's considered polite society and also what her family was talking about. And that photograph there was taken in 1873 in the middle of all of this. And I love that determined stare on her face where she's just like, I will do everything I have to do, and I'm going to face it all down. After the scandal kind of dies down, she returns back to Hartford, Connecticut, her home. But she starts working again on women's rights, but not with the quite same zeal that she had before. In 1877, the Connecticut Senate lets her testify on behalf of a married woman's property tax bill, and this tax bill is actually something that Isabella and John drafted in 1870, and then for the next 7 years repeatedly tried to introduce it as legislation over and over and over again until it is finally ratified in 1877. And this gave married women their own legal identity in Connecticut, which was a huge step forward for women's rights, specifically in Connecticut. And then at the 1878 Washington Convention for the NWSA, Isabella presents another resolution that Congress should add a 16th Amendment that granted women's suffrage. And you can see she's still continuing the same argument in 1888 with the constitutional rights of the women of the United States. And this was actually something that Isabella wrote and presented at the International Council of Women that was held in Washington, D.C. in 1888. And that picture there on the far right, that's a picture of Isabella that was taken in 1888. Again, she continues that determined stare, we're going to make this work. A few years, excuse me, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So within the constitutional rights of women in the United States, Isabella points out every other law recognizes women by the use of the masculine pronoun and compels her to pay taxes, be fined, imprisoned, and hung as he, his, and him. And it is simply absurd and wicked to tax and hang a woman by one statute and deny her the right to vote by another, when the phraseology is precisely the same in both. She goes on and she calls this the degradation of women, that men are essentially their sovereigns, every one of whom is considered competent to legislate for her and to sit in judgment upon her by court and jury now and forevermore. This is a very passionate document. She's really kind of holding no stops. She's just coming all out and just letting it all out. It's an amazing thing to read, considering how women are supposed to be acting at the time. So after this, she really kind of just focuses on women's suffrage within the state of Connecticut. She sends 4 more bills to the legislature. One, that women cannot be taxed until they are represented by themselves in government. And also she asked to remove the word male from the state constitution, giving women suffrage on school elections and the sale of liquor. In the end, she only is successful on getting women the right to school election suffrage, and that gets passed in 1893. But so after that, she's just really kind of starts going around Connecticut to small towns and helping women establish political science clubs, as she's calling them, when they're really women's rights and women's suffrage clubs. But by the 1890s at this point, she's really kind of recognized as like one of the grand dames of the suffrage movement in the United States. You have the League of Women's Suffrage in New York giving her this huge honor. And then in 1893, it's the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And what they do there is they decide to have a women's building. And so the women's building is where they're like, that's going to contain all the exhibitions concerning women, that it's going to be organized by women. So you have all the women's science experiments, all of the art that they're producing, their industry, all of that, that's going to be in the women's building. And to run the women's building, they decide to have a board of lady managers. And Isabella is selected by the Connecticut centennial commissioners to be the representative for the state of Connecticut. And so that's what's on the right there is a page from the book about the Board of Lady Managers, where they start picturing who's all involved. And of course, there is Isabella's photograph there, which is obviously the one from 1888. So also, this is a great photograph of Isabella and her husband John in 1891 that was taken in honor of their 50th wedding anniversary. And on the right side is a photograph of Isabella. Standing behind her is her oldest daughter, Alice. And that's Alice's daughter, Catherine Day, who's sitting down by Isabella's feet. So she's really starts focusing on her family at this point, because with the Tilden scandal and also her involvement with the women's suffrage movement, her daughter's husbands would not allow them any contact with their mother because they just thought their mother was way too liberal and kind of off her rocker. And it wasn't until later on that she was able to regain relationships with her daughters and their families and their children. And so she's really kind of beginning to slow down by the 1890s. By the end of 1900, she is literally the last surviving Beecher. All of her siblings have passed away by then. John dies in 1901. In 1902, the Connecticut Constitutional Convention was held in Hartford, and Isabella again prepares a speech, and she has it printed in pamphlet. She's all ready to go hand it out, but as she is, they refuse to let her speak at all, and she's just absolutely devastated by this. And she later writes that this was a crushing blow, for it ended all hope of my living to see women of my native state put under the responsibilities of citizenship by the vote of honorable men. So kind of after this, she really retreats from the public stage, but she does occasionally write a few like letters to editors and local newspapers and that sort of thing about suffrage. And on January 13th, 1907, she suffers a stroke. She lingers for nearly 2 weeks before she dies on January 25th. In her obituary that was printed in the Hartford Courant, it noted that Isabella had a fair share of the ability and originality which characterized Mrs. Stowe and Henry Ward Beecher. It was a family of ideas and convictions where they never hesitated from expressing their convictions, and the popularity of their ideas was not taken into account, which I think is a really great summing up of Isabella, where she just took that Beecher passion and just went full throttle into the women's suffrage movement. She was just an amazing woman, and I think it's a shame that we're just now beginning to really kind of learn about her and study her life when all the other Beecher siblings have been studied so much in the past. And that's pretty much it. I'll try to get my microphone working again. I don't know if I will be able to do that because I would really love to hear your questions instead of making you submit them all through the chat feature. Let's see here.
So, Anne, can you hear me now?
What can I do?
Anne, can you hear me? All right, I will go ahead and...
Oh, I see your lips moving, Christina, but I still can't hear you.
Okay.
Might do Q&A,
so
but she's
I will...
I don't know why I can't hear you. Oh, let me see.
Is there some...
I didn't flip it. The poll is clean, so I just kind of made it up real quick. I know we need to flip it.
All right, so let's take a look at the questions in the chat. Fred has asked, do we know if there are any descendants of Isabella?
Still can't hear everyone.
Okay. Let's see if this will. I'm going to try to call Anne and see if she can hear me that way. But she probably doesn't have her phone close by.
Probably gets on her phone.
No. Okay.
Ah, wait, I hear now. I can hear.
Can you hear me?
I did something.
Okay.
I fixed it. Okay, great.
All right. So big first question. Do we know if there are any descendants of Isabella?
Oh, today?
Yes.
That is a good question. That would actually involve some family tree research because each of her daughters had daughters. And then she had a son, Ned, who I believe had a couple of children as well. So I'm not 100% sure if anyone in her direct lineage
I saw the FedEx truck come earlier, and I didn't pay attention. It
is
didn't ring the
still
bell or
alive.
anything, and they were sitting. Fellows were sitting outside our door. Yeah, I know we need to.
Mary,
I don't know.
Mary, your microphone is on.
Oh. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
We have two businesses running out of this house. But I typed my question. I was just kind of joking, but it's like, what kind of coffee did she drink? She was fantastic to get everything done that she did in her life.
You know, I think the Beechers themselves just had this incredible energy that let them do everything. Because you look at all the stuff that Catherine was doing, that she stuck her fingers in, like how many pies at the same time, and then everything Harriet was doing at the same time, and then also all of her brothers. They were just an amazing family. It's like when you read any history involving a Beecher, it's kind of like a who's who of United States history, essentially, where you just are kind of amazed at what they were able to accomplish. What makes that opening quote, you know, the America is just pretty much saints, sinners, and Beechers, really kind of a very adequate thing to say. And I see John Getz noted that Hooker is an old name in Connecticut, and yes, John's family, one of his descendants, was actually a signer of the original Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and they were very proud of that. Yeah.
All right. Other questions? My question for you is, what's the most surprising or interesting thing you learned about Isabella?
The most surprising thing, well, I just even learning anything about her is hard to do because later in life she got very involved in spiritualism, and she really kind of threw herself into it, and because of that, one historian in particular wrote that she was basically insane. And he used her journals, her personal journals that she never meant to have published or made public at all. And they used her journals to kind of make that case that, yeah, she was this crazy lady. She was like the crazy black sheep child of the family. And it just kept getting repeated over and over and over again, to the point where the family to this day at the Stowe Center in Hartford, Connecticut, will not allow anyone to actually read her journals. They have just blocked all public access to them. And so because she was always portrayed as like the crazy child, it is not until I would say like maybe the last like 10 years that you have anyone even writing about her in any way that actually examines her as her own individual person, separate from this one opinion that this one man had of her like almost 50 years ago. And so just the fact that you're able to find anything out there today at all that discusses her life separate from spiritualism is absolutely amazing. And it's so sad that we have to say that.
Okay.
But if you want to learn, read, there's some great books out there. There's one called The Beecher Sisters that really kind of examines all four of them. It's an excellent book by Barbara Wright. And then there's the other one called The Limits of Sisterhood, which I believe we did in the past in one of our semicolon clubs. And that's a really great look at all of the sisters and how they approach women's rights and their beliefs in it. And that also is really amazing. And it's also a great resource because they actually reproduce a lot of Isabella's writings directly as individual things that you can read.
All right. And it looks like both of our mothers have commented.
Okay.
Your mom says that the Beechers remind her of the Kennedy family, in the 50s and 60s. And my mom, who is an actor herself, is interested to hear what you feel is the most climactic moment of her life.
I would say probably the Tilton scandal, the Beecher Tilton scandal, because that was like, that's really what, how it's like the defining thing where it's like up until then, she's going great. And then boom, this hits. And because she's cut out from her family because of it, because she won't support her brother, it's like everything else is like her reaction to that. How does she come back from that for the rest of her life? So I think that would be really like the main huge thing in her life that I think happened to her. And I know personally in her own writing, she mentions this where she's just heartsick over this, and how her sisters that she was so close to refused to even talk to her, and they all lived in the same town. I mean, Mary lived there in Hartford. They were within walking distance of each other. Then you've got Harriet was living there at the time as well, also within walking distance. It was a very small town, and their level of society was also very restricted, and they all knew everybody. And all of a sudden, she's being shunned by everyone that she knew. And that was just so difficult for her. And so she really starts writing to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and to Susan B. Anthony, and they're writing back trying to help her because they're all supporting Isabella because they're like, your family's crazy. I don't know why they're supporting Henry Ward when obviously he's at fault. And so she really turns to her friends, and it's her friends that help her get through all of this rather than her family, which is a horrible thing to say. Yeah, let's see her.
I want to echo John Seymour's comment that the son-in-law's limiting contact with her would have been very disturbing to her and her daughters, I would think, that they're not allowed to talk to their mom because I guess people thought she was crazy or she was too radical.
She was too radical. That was what her daughter's husbands, that was their main argument. They were afraid that she was going to take those radical ideas and instill them in their children, her grandchildren. What she does kind of do after she is able to talk with them again, Mary, her second daughter, ends up separating from her husband and does end up living back home again with her parents. And so Isabella is really able to fix that relationship. Unfortunately, Mary dies at a very early age. I think she contracted pneumonia. And so that was devastating for Isabella, but fortunately they were able to reconcile before that happened. And it was actually Mary's death that really brings Alice back to her mother as well, where she just kind of realizes, we're just being silly. I need to be involved in her life again. Also interesting, at the same time, Alice's marriage kind of falls apart at the same time a little bit. So her husband's not as prevalent in influence in her life. So she's able to go back to her mother. And so they were able to kind of get back together again after that. But for like a good 20 years, she was cut off from her daughters. And she does write in her journals and in letters to her friends how hard that was for her, that she didn't have this contact with her own family. Mm-hmm. Let's see here. Oh, I see a question about what were Isabella's views on spiritualism and did they hinder her work on women's rights? Actually, she becomes involved in spiritualism because it did support women's rights. The spiritualist movement in the United States in the 19th century is really kind of fascinating on its own. And a lot of women who end up being involved in the women's rights movement within the United States are also spiritualists as well. And in fact, within that movement itself, it was mostly run by women. It was something where women could be taken seriously in what they did. And also at this time, spiritualism was much more accepted than it is considered today. I mean, think about it. Abraham Lincoln was holding seances in the White House trying to contact his own dead children. So, and you've got, it's also too, a lot of this is the effect of the Civil War, where you have so many family members were killed horribly. And people are just desperate to try to find a way to contact them again. So Isabella getting involved in spiritualism wasn't really a surprise because pretty much everyone was, even Harriet herself was, but Isabella took it to a level that most people did not do, where she honestly believed that she was going into trances and speaking with dead people and writing in different hands and everything else in her journals, and that's why she was considered to be insane by a number of historians. Let's see here. What other questions have we got?
So there was one on, could you repeat what was the major catalyst that put her on the path of the women's rights movement above other issues that she could have supported?
Oh, okay. Well, she did support abolition through her husband's work. John Hooker got her into that, and it was what set her on to it. Let me go back and find the actual. So it was Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who is an interesting guy. He was also very liberal and progressive and a very early male supporter of women's rights. And it was his article, Ought Women to Learn the Alphabet, in 1859, where he discusses women's education and how it would lead to them becoming involved in politics, that she read, that for her was really kind of the thing that set her off and set her thinking. Because she did have some questions about women's rights and how women are viewed within society at the time that she really was not okay with. I think there was one quote I said where she mentioned that it had been 20 years since I shut my teeth with a snap and resolutely vowed I would not talk about this with any man. And so reading that article just really kind of set her free and let her kind of examine, like, what can we be doing as women. And she decided that the best thing that women should be doing is getting the right to vote, so they can actually make these changes themselves and not have to kind of come up with these ideas, present them to a couple of men and hope to God that they support them and will then send that through the government and all of its processes. She wanted to have direct involvement. And I think a lot of that was really kind of influenced by her father, Lyman, because he really set up this whole idea of get involved in these social issues, social justice. Yeah, let's do that. Of course, he was talking to his sons more than he was to his daughters, but at the same time, he kind of gave that whole idea to his daughters as well. I mean, look at what Catherine did. She becomes almost like a Martha Stewart of her day, which is ironic because she never had a home of her own or a family because she never married. So she was constantly staying at all of her family members' homes, but she was still managed to write about, this is how you should be arranging your house. This is how you should be educating your children. And then you have Harriet, of course, with Uncle Tom's Cabin and all of her work in the abolitionist movement that we're obviously still talking about today. They were very involved and very much had their pulse on what they believed were the things that women should be doing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So another question talks about, Emmett's interested in knowing, so Isabella's clearly different from the rest of her family, the rest of the Beechers, so what influenced her to become this way and gave her the courage to stand apart from the rest?
That is a really great question. And it's a hard one to answer. That's what everyone keeps talking about today, where they're just like, why was she the one? Why was she the one who was like the most liberal, who just went all out there for all these crazy ideas that no one else in her family would support? And I kind of wonder if some of this has to be where she is the youngest daughter. She's not the youngest child. She's in fact the eldest of the three children that were born by Harriet Porter Beecher, Lyman's second wife. But of those three children, she seems to be the one who was the most public. Her two brothers end up becoming ministers like all their other brothers, and they're not as out there on the national stage as a lot of their older siblings are. And so it's of them, I think it's really Isabella who kind of like takes in that whole idea of like, oh yes, we should be out there. We should be putting our opinions out there for the public because everyone should know them. Of course, we have something to say. And I think in that she got more influence from Catherine and from Harriet than probably anyone else in the family. So from her older sisters, she kind of got this idea is like, this is why I think I have the courage to say what I feel needs to be said. And her father did instill her with a great conviction in your personal beliefs, which is why she had that courage again to go out and do it. And I do think it's interesting that she was almost a full generation younger than Catherine. And maybe that was the reason why she became so liberal. It was like she looked at what Catherine was saying, she looked at what Mary was saying and what Harriet was saying, and she didn't agree with any of it, and she felt like she should say that. So she probably came to that on her own, I would say, and then just used her family's influence to make those thoughts public and very well known.
Okay. The next question, it looks like we're caught up with Isabella's grandniece, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who we talked about in the Year of the Woman discussion back in October, carries on this Beecher reforming legacy into the 20th century. Do you think Isabella was a strong influence on Charlotte Perkins Gilman?
I think so too, because I would also note that Charlotte Perkins Gilman is the granddaughter of Mary, who was very conservative, who said, I have to ignore everything, all of my desires, and focus on my husband. And she tried to instill that on Isabella, and it didn't quite work, obviously. So I think Charlotte was probably influenced by Isabella. I know Isabella, once her family, because she was the last surviving Beecher, and after they kept dying off, more of the family kept talking to her again. She was able to reconcile with her sisters before they all passed away, which was a good thing. I think Catherine was the first one to forgive her, mostly because she says, I'm too old to deal with this. and so she starts contacting Isabella again, and I think actually comes to stay with her unannounced once, as Catherine did to a lot of her family. So I think, so once that happens, and Mary does pass away in 1900, and it would be natural that her children and grandchildren would reach out to the surviving family members, which was Isabella, hang in there until the bitter end. And so, yeah, I think she did have some influence on them. I know she had some influence on her nieces and nephews on the Hooker side as well. I've seen some pictures of her with some of them. She kind of takes them in as like her surrogate daughters in terms of relationships, because her own daughters weren't talking to her. So yeah, I think she did have a lot of influence on the rest of her family, the younger generations in particular, because obviously coming in later, they would have, comparatively speaking to the older generation, more liberal and progressive views that Isabella was completely talking about.
All right. That's all the questions in the chat. Is there anything anybody else is interested in knowing or talking about before we wrap up? It is a little after 5, so we're going to need to wrap up soon, but any last comments or questions from anybody?
No? Well, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. I was really glad to have a chance, despite technical difficulties, to share Isabella with all of you. She was such an awesome, awesome lady that we all need to know about her.
So again, thank you all for joining us on this lovely Sunday afternoon. We appreciate it, and make sure you check our website for other upcoming events and presentations and discussion groups and so forth. I see most people on here are members of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and we do have our annual member meeting coming up on December 3rd. So make sure that you do the reservation for that, and then you'll get the Zoom link for the annual member meeting as well. We do want to thank again the Ohio Humanities Council and the W.E. Smith Family Foundation, who were the financial supporters of the Isabela Beecher Hooker exhibit. And I will say thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day. See you next time that we're all online.